The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, August 24th, 1572. It is one of the most infamous episodes in French history, where a series of initially targeted assassinations of Huguenot leaders spiraled into a brutal and widespread slaughter of Huguenots by Catholics during the infamous French Wars of Religion. The violence began in Paris and rapidly spread to other cities, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Protestants who had converged for the politically charged wedding of a Protestant Henry of Navarre and the Catholic Margaret of Valois. Orchestrated by influential Catholic nobles and even sanctioned by King Charles IX under sway of his mother Catherine de' Medici, the massacre was intended to curb Protestant influence, which was seen as a threat to the Catholic hegemony. It was an event that not only decimated the Huguenot population, but it also deepened the religious and civil strife in France. It also provoked international horror and drastically altered the course of French history by intensifying the wars of religion that continued to ravage the country for years to come. Hello and welcome to the channel. If it is your first time here, it's good to meet you. And if you are coming back, it's great to have you back with me again. As always, if you'd like to support the channel, you're already doing it. The best support you can give is just to enjoy the content at whatever pace you choose. But for those who want to go above and beyond, a like and subscribe definitely helps, and you may find a link in the video description if you really want to go further above and further beyond. Now, without further ado, and with that out of the way, let's get nice and relaxed and delve into what is a somewhat of an unpleasant topic. But once again, as with all topics of unpleasantness, they do need to be discussed and learned about. The Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, a very horrific turning point in the history of France, has its roots in a series of very complex events. You see, it all began with the Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, signed on the 8th of August 1570, which ended the Third War of Religion by promising a fragile peace between Catholics and the Huguenots in France. But this peace was of course tenuous, mainly due to the refusal of the staunch Catholics, particularly the influential Guise family, to accept the terms which allowed for the reintegration of Huguenots into political life. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a prominent Huguenot leader, returned to the Royal Council in September 1571, an inclusion that horrified the most devout of Catholics. But despite their distaste for the Protestants, the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, and her son King Charles IX recognized the necessity of peace to alleviate the kingdom's dire financial strains, and also to contend with the formidable Huguenot defences in strategic towns like La Rochelle and Montauban. A pivotal effort to further secure this peace was arranged the marriage between Henry of Navarre, a Protestant and future King Henry IV, and Margaret of Valois, Catherine's Catholic daughter. Scheduled for the 18th of August 1572, this union was intended to symbolize the potential for reconciliation between the warring religious factions. However, this alliance was met with opposition from conservative Catholic circles and outright condemnation from the external Catholic powers like Pope Gregory XIII and also King Philip II of Spain, who viewed it as a betrayal of the Catholic faith. The tension reached a critical point with the attempted assassination of Admiral Coligny on August 22nd of 1572, just days after the wedding, signaling the failure of the royal marriage to quell the underlying hostilities. The attack on Coligny acted as a catalyst for the ensuing massacre, as fears and suspicion among the Catholics surged, leading to one of the darkest episodes in religious conflicts of all time. So, this marriage between Henry of Navarre and Margaret of Valois was set up with high hopes, intended as this symbol of reconciliation between the Catholics and the Huguenots, finally bringing them together. And everybody loves a wedding, right? Well, ironically, it was the thing that set the stage for the conflict. Who would have thought? The union drew a large assembly of high-ranking Protestants to Paris, a city where sentiments were vehemently anti-Huguenot and predominantly Catholic. The Parisians were already inflamed by Catholic preachers who had stirred them up into a frenzy, and they were incensed at this prospect of a French princess, one of their own, a Catholic princess, marrying a Protestant. It intensified the already strained relations. This period also was marked by economic hardship. It was difficult for everybody all the way around. We're talking poor harvests that had led to increased taxes, and then, of course, rising food prices exacerbated the discontent among the populace, a vicious circle. Cost of living kept getting higher and higher, and the people were not happy. I suppose history does repeat itself. The opulence, however, displayed during the royal wedding ceremonies, well, that was an even bigger slap in the face. It further alienated the common people, who contrasted their suffering with the rampant extravagance of the elite, particularly when those poor people were encouraged to go out and see such an event. Well, when you see all the golden carriages and all the rich people in their pretty dresses and nice clothing going past with their white horses in satin, definitely does not make you feel like an equal. Well, adding to the tensions was the symbolic battle over a memorial cross at the site of Philippe de Gastin's former home. Now, Gastin was a Huguenot who was executed in 1569, and he had his house destroyed by a mob who erected a large cross in its place. Under the peace terms, the cross was removed in December of 1571, which was a very controversial decision, and it led to riots that claimed around 50 lives and saw further mob violence. Now, you see, this cross was not put there as a memorial to Gastin's. No. It was put there as a trophy and a commemoration of the Catholics winning over the Protestants. Well, of course, things like that should perhaps be removed if we're all trying to get along again. Well, they weren't very happy when it was. Now, the French court itself, they had their own opinions, and they were deeply divided on the issue. Catherine de' Medici faced significant challenges in orchestrating the wedding due to the absence of papal approval from Pope Gregory the 13th rather, leading to reluctance among French prelates. Of course, you have to be careful. Nobody wants to get excommunicated. Now, her diplomatic prowess was tested, as she persuaded the Cardinal de Bourbon to officiate the marriage, despite his Catholic faith and his familial ties to the Protestant groom. Amidst these tensions, the political rivalries at court only intensified further. The powerful Guise family was completely unwilling to cede influence to their adversaries, the Montmorency family. Francois, Duke of Montmorency, and the governor of Paris, found himself quite unable to quell the escalating disturbances. His departure from Paris to Chantilly on August the 20th, just days before the massacre, was a bit of a hint that he knew what was coming. Before the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a significant shift occurred in the Huguenot political rhetoric, which began to challenge not just the policies of the French monarchy, but the institution of monarchy itself, an idea that was certainly way before its time. This ideological shift was influenced by John Calvin's work, Readings on the Prophet Daniel, published in 1561, where he suggested that kings who disobey God effectively forfeit their right to govern, a departure from his earlier stance that advocated obedience even to ungodly rulers. This notion was quickly adopted and expanded upon by the Huguenot writers, who started to discuss the sovereignty of the people, drawing fierce responses from Catholic counterparts. The massacre itself dramatically transformed Huguenot attitudes towards the French monarchy. You see, previously many Huguenots had demonstrated loyalty to the crown, but the slaughter and all the unpleasantness led them to advocate for more radical actions. With nothing left to lose, they even included the deposition or assassination of kings that they deemed ungodly. This marked a significant evolution in French Protestantism, which now positioned itself in open conflict with the monarchy, challenging its very legitimacy and existence. The political climate was further strained by events outside of France. In May of 1572, news arrived in Paris that a Huguenot force under Louis of Nassau had captured Mons and Valenciennes in the Netherlandish province of Hainaut, signaling the potential French involvement in the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule. Louis, governing the Principality of Orange on behalf of his brother William the Silent, leader of the Dutch revolt, was perceived by many French Catholics as being influenced by Admiral Coligny. Coligny had previously convinced the king to support the Dutch rebels in October of 1571, though this decision was later reversed by Catherine de' Medici. After the wedding between Catholic Margaret de Valois and Protestant Henry de Navarre on August 18, 1572, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny and other prominent Huguenots stayed in Paris to discuss the unresolved issues stemming from the Peace of Saint-Germain. On August 22nd, as Coligny returned from the Louvre, he was gravely wounded by a gunshot from an upstairs window, likely fired by one Charles de Louvière, the Lord of Mervert. The assailant managed to flee amidst the chaos that followed. Now, there are suspicions about who orchestrated the attempt on Coligny's life, and several figures are involved. Now, not the person in general, but mainly the ones who had orchestrated the entire plan. First of all, the Guises. Cardinal of Lorraine, who was in Rome at the time, and his nephews, the Dukes of Guise and Aumale, had motives rooted in deep historical grievances. They sought to avenge the assassination of the Duke's father, Francis, Duke of Guise, whom they believed Coligny had a hand in killing a decade earlier. Importantly, the shot was fired from a property that was owned by the Guise family. There is also the Duke of Alba. As the governor of the Netherlands for Philip II of Spain, Alba viewed Coligny as a direct threat due to the admiral's plans to support the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule. That summer, Coligny had covertly sent troops to aid Protestant forces in Mons, then under siege by Alba's forces. And lastly, Catherine de' Medici herself. The Queen Mother, Catherine, was purportedly anxious about Coligny's growing influence over her son, King Charles. She feared that Coligny's hawkish stance on foreign policy would entangle France in a war with Spain over the Netherlands, a scenario that she was obviously eager to avoid. Well, either way, the attempted assassination of Admiral de Coligny precipitated the crisis that led to the Massacre. As the leading Huguenot figure, Coligny had a strong rapport with King Charles IX, though he was viewed with suspicion by the king's mother, of course. Knowing the potential for Protestant retaliation, the king and his advisers assured Coligny of justice while visiting him as he recuperated. Meanwhile, Protestants demanding justice interrupted the Queen Mother during her dinner. How dare they? Heightening the tension. You don't interrupt somebody having dinner. Now that's just rude. Although there was no immediate plan of attack, the presence of Coligny's brother-in-law's 4,000-strong army outside of Paris certainly made the Catholics inside a little nervous. They had thought a possible revenge was coming, either against the Guises or just the Parisian Catholics in general, whichever came first. That very evening, Catherine convened with her Italian advisers at the Tuileries Palace. Later, on the night of August 23rd, she and Charles resolved to eradicate the Protestant leadership. Although the specifics of the discussion are lost, it likely targeted about 2 or 3 dozen Protestant nobles who had remained in Paris. These leaders, like Coligny, were typically accompanied by their own entourage, necessitating the elimination of these groups as well. Well, subsequently, Parisian officials were instructed to seal the city off and arm the populace to stop any potential Protestant uprising. Even the Swiss guards were assigned to execute the designated Protestant leaders. The exact timeline and initiation of the massacre still remain a little bit unclear, but it is believed that the signal to start was given by the ringing of the Matins bell at the Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois church near the Louvre. Following this, the Swiss guards ousted the Protestant nobles from the Louvre and executed them, right there in the streets. On Sunday, August 24th, 1572, at noon in the Holy Innocent Cemetery, a withered hawthorn bush suddenly began to bloom near an image of the Virgin, which Parisians took as a divine endorsement of the mass killings. That's one way to view it, I suppose. Well, that same night, a group led by the Duke of Guise forcibly entered Admiral de Coligny's residence, killed him, and threw his body from a window. The Huguenot nobles in the building initially resisted, attempting to save their leader, but Coligny insisted that he face his death with a rather notable composure. Jacques-Auguste de Thou, a historian of the time, noted that one assassin admired Coligny's calmness and steadfastness in the face of his destiny. The violence, sparked by the long-standing tensions from the Peace of Saint-Germain, escalated to widespread attacks on Protestants across Paris, targeting even women and even children. The streets were barricaded, Protestants were trapped in their homes, and the deceased were carted away and dumped into the River Seine. Despite King Charles' efforts, the massacre persisted for 3 days. A historian by the name of Holt mentioned that while the killings were not universally intended by the court, some Catholics at court did intervene to save individual Protestants. Researcher Jeremy Foa suggested that the massacres were executed by militant groups who had prepared lists of Protestants who were marked for death, though the broader population did not actively participate. And remarkably, Henry of Navarre and the Prince of Condé, leading the Huguenots, were spared, but only after they agreed to convert to Catholicism. There's always a catch, isn't there? Well, of course they did, but they both later renounced their forced conversions as soon as they escaped Paris. So, I suppose their heart was never in it to begin with. Their survival might have been strategically planned by Catherine de' Medici, however, to balance power against the House of Guise. August 26. The royal court, attempting to control the narrative, presented the massacre as a preemptive move against a supposed Huguenot coup. Well, this was declared during a lit de justice at the Paris Parliament. Subsequently, a jubilee with a grand procession was held to celebrate, even as the massacre continued in parts of the city. Despite King Charles' orders on August 24th to maintain peace and uphold the 1570 edict, from August to October, massacres of Huguenots occurred in 12 other cities, including Toulouse, Bordeaux, Rouen, Orléans, and many more. These massacres typically happened quickly after the news of the Paris event spread, although in some cities there was a delay. And it's notable that these cities shared common traits: Catholic majorities with significant, if previously larger, Protestant minorities that had experienced intense religious strife, and in some cases, Protestant control during the First Civil War. In many instances, local Catholics believed that they were following royal orders to start the massacre, sometimes communicated by visiting messengers or local nobles, although it is unlikely that these orders came directly from King Charles. However, the Duke of Anjou, the king's brother, did send out letters urging massacres in the king's name. For example, in Nantes, the mayor held on to such a letter without disclosing it until he received contrary orders from the king a week later. The role of the populace and authorities varied by city. In some places, mobs led the violence, while in others, small groups of soldiers and officials targeted Protestants with little mass involvement. In Bordeaux, a sermon by the Jesuit Edmond Auger on September 29th spurred a massacre a few days later. The impact on the Huguenot communities was devastating, not only in terms of death, but also through mass conversions to Catholicism and emigration due to the hostile environment. In Rouen, for example, the Huguenot population decreased from 16,500 to fewer than 3,000 due to killings, conversions, and emigration. And I must say, the 3,000 that remained, well, you must commend them on their bravery. Even cities not experiencing violence saw significant declines in their Huguenot populations. The Huguenot community, which may have constituted up to 10% of France's population before the massacre, dropped to as low as 7% by the end of the century, with further declines during Louis XV's reign, 14th rather, and the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. This period of intense persecution paved the way for the Fourth Civil War, which began in that same year. Estimates of the death toll from the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, of course, vary widely, ranging from as few as 2,000 to as many as 70,000. A Roman Catholic apologist put the number at the lower end, of course, while the Huguenot Maximilien de Bethune, a survivor of the massacre, put it at the higher end of 70,000. But historians have struggled to determine accurate figures, and there is really no consensus, even among modern scholars. More specialized historians tend to propose lower numbers. For example, in 1978, one Philip Benedict estimated about 2,000 deaths in Paris and 3,000 in the provinces. Other historians suggest a total of around 10,000, split between 3,000 in Paris and 7,000 elsewhere. But at the higher end of the estimates, figures reach up to 20,000 to 30,000, based on contemporary, non-Parisian estimates cited by historians Felipe Fernandez Armesto and a few others. Now, for Paris specifically, concrete data includes a record of the city paying workmen to collect and bury 1,100 bodies found along the Seine in just 1 week. This number is used to extrapolate the other accounts based on similar payments. The massacre also claimed the lives of notable individuals, such as the philosopher Petrus Ramus and the composer Claude Codimel in Lyon. In a grim testament to the massacre's brutality, bodies floating down the Rhône from Lyon reportedly deterred the people of Arles from drinking the river water for 3 months. Well, the Politiques, who were Catholics prioritizing national unity over religious divisions, were appalled by the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, though many Catholics in and outside of France initially saw it as a necessary prevention of a Huguenot coup. The beheaded Coligny's head was reportedly sent to Pope Gregory XIII, but it only reached as far as Lyon. The Pope celebrated the event by commissioning a Te Deum and having a commemorative medal struck, depicting an angel with a cross and a sword, and standing over fallen Protestants, labeled with the date 1572. Now, Pope Gregory also had Giorgio Vasari paint 3 frescoes in the Sala Regia depicting Coligny's wounding, his death, and Charles IX before Parliament, linking these events to the divine victory at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. he designated September 11th, 1572 as a joint commemoration day for both events, framing the massacres as divine retribution against a dire threat to Christendom. Despite initial celebrations in Rome, doubts had emerged within the papal curia as the details of the massacre's true nature began to unfold. Gregory declined to meet with Charles de Maurevert, Coligny's alleged assassin, and even labeled him as a murderer. Philip II of Spain is said to have laughed upon hearing the news, one of the rare instances of him showing any kind of amusement. Strange sense of humor, I'm sure. In contrast, the French poet Jean-Antoine de Baif composed a sonnet lavishly praising the massacre. However, reactions elsewhere were of disgust and horror. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II, who was Charles' father-in-law, by the way, condemned the events as, I quote, a shameful bloodbath. This sentiment caused many moderate French Catholics to question the cost of religious uniformity, leading to increased support for the politiques who advocated for a national harmony over this sectarian conflict. The massacre triggered a major international crisis, shocking the Protestant nations deeply. Catherine de' Medici's diplomatic efforts, notably a mission by Gondi, were critical in maintaining her policy of amicable relations with these countries. Sir Francis Walsingham, the English ambassador, narrowly survived the event, and even Tsar Ivan the Terrible expressed dismay at the violence in a letter to the emperor. And if Ivan the Terrible thinks that you've done the wrong thing and you were a little bit too violent, well, perhaps it's time to engage in a little bit of introspection. But of course, the event also produced a wealth of polemical literature, filled with theories and biases. Many Catholic authors came out and praised the king's decisive actions against the alleged Huguenot coup, albeit regretting the abandonment of more conciliatory policies. These works often tried to justify the mob violence as driven by a, I quote, laudable zeal which is difficult to restrain once it has been stirred up, pretty much saying, like Pringles, once you pop, you can't stop. Well, in contrast, Huguenot accounts focused on the violence, brutal details, propagated conspiracy theories of a premeditated massacre, and expressed strong anti-Italian sentiment against Catherine de' Medici and her Italian advisors. Diplomatic writings were more inclined to acknowledge the event's unplanned and chaotic nature, a view supported by memoirs from the court witnesses, including Margaret of Valois. Her memoirs provide the only royal eyewitness account of the massacre. Additionally, a widely referenced but ultimately discredited account attributed to Henry, Duke of Anjou, persisted until the 19th century. This fabricated account included the famous command, purportedly from Charles IX. Apparently, according to this account, Charles IX had said the words, and I quote, "Well then, so be it. Kill them, but kill them all. Don't leave a single one alive to reproach me." Citation needed on that one, I think. Well, the author of the Letter of Pierre Charpentier in 1572 was viewed as a Protestant of sorts, suggesting he had insider knowledge, yet he was also an extreme apologist for the massacre, viewing it as a deserved punishment for prolonged civil disobedience and covert sedition. The perspective diverges from the mainstream Catholic interpretation and aligns with a particular Catholic narrative, especially among Italian authors who saw the massacre as a cleverly orchestrated strategy, meticulously planned from the very beginning. Among the most vehement of these was Camillo Capillupi, a papal secretary, whose writings suggested that the events from 1570 onwards were part of a deliberate scheme by Charles IX, executed by deceiving even his own mother and ministers. Although his work was too controversial to be printed in Venice, it did find publishers in Rome, and was swiftly translated and reprinted in Geneva in 1574. And the incident was also framed by many as an example of Machiavellian tactics, largely due to Innocent Gentilet's work Discourses Against Machiavelli in 1576. Gentilet's work, rapidly reprinted in multiple languages, mistakenly claimed that Machiavelli's writings were highly esteemed by the French court. They weren't, accusing them of contributing to France's moral decline and the massacre's brutality. Of course, there are many who refute this, noting the absence of significant Machiavellian influence in French literature prior to the massacre, and its modest presence afterwards until Gentilet's book itself. But nevertheless, the narrative significantly influenced the era's views on Machiavellianism, reinforcing the anti-Italian sentiment prevalent in Huguenot critiques and shaping the enduring perception of Machiavellianism in political practices. A notable Elizabethan playwright, one Christopher Marlowe, was deeply influenced by the ideas of Machiavellianism. In his play The Jew of Malta in 1589, he introduces the character of Machiavel, who claims to inhabit the soul of the Duke of Guise, suggesting a continuation of Machiavellian influence beyond the grave. This theme is further explored in Marlowe's last play, The Massacre at Paris. I wonder what that is about. Of course, it dramatizes the Bartholomew's Day massacre and portrays both the Duke of Guise and Catherine de' Medici as the archetypal Machiavellian villains. The view of the massacres as a calculated Machiavellian plot persisted well into the 20th century, with the Catholic Encyclopedia of 1913 describing it as a political act justified by Machiavellian principles, where the ends always justify the means. But of course, the interpretation of the massacre has shifted over time, with Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire using it as a critique towards organized religion. The historian Lord Acton initially wavered on whether the massacre was premeditated, but ultimately concluded that it was not. By the late 19th century, a scholarly consensus did emerge that the massacre was not the result of long-term planning. The long-standing narrative holds that Catherine de' Medici and her Catholic advisors were primarily responsible for orchestrating the massacre of key military leaders, manipulating King Charles IX, who is portrayed as weak-willed and hesitant. But this view, however, has been revised somewhat by modern scholars who question its accuracy. More recent findings suggest that the plot's main architects were four influential figures, such as Henry, the Duke of Anjou, Chancellor Birague, the Duke of Nevers, and the Comte de Retz, Gondi, all Italian advisors at the French court. Jean-Louis Bergeon shifts the focus to the socio-political climate of Paris, claiming the city itself, rather than any single individual or group, was the catalyst. He describes Paris as a powder keg of anti-Huguenot sentiment, ripe for violence. The Guise family, capitalizing on their popularity and the city's volatile atmosphere, pressured the monarchy to act against the Huguenots, effectively manipulating the king and queen mother into action. Thierry Van Ekvelen places the primary responsibility on Henry, Duke of Anjou, Charles's ambitious younger brother. He contends that after a failed attempt on the life of Coligny, attributed to the Guises and Spanish agents, Catherine's Italian advisors saw an opportunity to eliminate the Huguenot threat by executing the Protestant leaders. Now, despite opposition from Catherine and the king, Anjou, leveraging his position as lieutenant general, orchestrated the massacre with the help of the Parisian authorities and Duke Henry de Guise. The massacre, according to Van Ekvelen, emerged from those complex interactions and was rationalized by the following day by a royal declaration that condemned the violence, yet also framed it as a necessary action to prevent this Protestant coup. Another opinion comes from Mac Holt, a professor at George Mason University, and it concurs that Vigor, renowned as Paris's most influential preacher, delivered sermons filled with ominous warnings about the potential consequences of potential Protestant control over Paris. The narrative is supported by others, Cunningham and Grell, who in their 2000 publication noted that sermons by priests like Vigor heightened the religious and eschatological fervor preceding the massacre. Thus, the extreme tension and bitterness in Paris by August of 1572 created a volatile atmosphere. Tension was fueled by a decade marked by 3 civil wars and multiple attempts by Protestant nobles to seize power in France. Some scholars argue that the absolute regard in which the sovereign's office was held, bolstered by French Roman Catholic theologians, contributed to this situation. According to them, the extraordinary powers granted to French kings came with significant responsibilities, the most crucial of which was combating heresy. The massacre stands out as a particularly horrifying event in history due to the nature of the violence. You see, it's Christians massacring fellow Christians, who were not foreign adversaries, but their neighbors, those who lived beside them, across the road for them, or a short walk. It was the guy who sold you the vegetables down the road, the one who would sew the buttons back on your jacket. People knew each other, and it only took a little bit of preaching and propaganda to turn them to each other's throats. These were individuals and families that had coexisted within the same Christian community under unified rule for over a millennium. Moreover, the religious divide among the French population, marked by distinct differences in dress, diet, and daily activities between the Catholics and Huguenots, deepened into a significant social rift. They might have only been small changes. To you and me, they don't matter too much. But But like I said, a little bit of propaganda goes a long way. The royal marriage, intended to bridge these divides, paradoxically intensified them, solidifying feelings of alienation and otherness rather than fostering reconciliation. Now, just to end, on a significant note, I suppose we can say, during his visit to Paris for the 12th World Youth Day on August 23, 1997, Pope John Paul II reflected on the massacre, pointing out the moral and ethical contradictions it represented in the light of Christian teachings. In his address to the vast assembly of young people, the Pope underscored that the events, deeply rooted in political and religious complexity, were fundamentally at odds with the principles of the Gospel. Though he stressed the paramount importance of forgiveness and dialogue as pathways to true and enduring Christian reconciliation. Furthermore, he advocated for the acceptance and respect of diverse religious traditions, emphasizing that such a diversity should foster unity and peace rather than conflict and division, guided, of course, by a shared love for their Lord. Well, thank you very much for listening. What a charming topic that was. I'd like to thank my top-tier supporters, Britt, Charles, Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, Wendy, Tim, James, and Eric. Thank you very much. And if you would like to support the channel, you know exactly what to do. I don't need to tell you, you're smart enough to figure it out. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all. And be nice to your neighbors. See you tomorrow.